For more on the significance of the election, let's go to Aurel Braun now. He's a Professor of International Relations and Political Science at the University of Toronto. Good to see you again, Aurel. Let's take the world view here. What does this change of government in Australia mean for foreign policy and international relations?
At the very least, there's likely to be a change in tone. Scott Morrison was a bombastic and at times confrontational leader. And he would get into also difficulties with other leaders, as with Emmanuel Macron in France. So now we are going to have someone, in the case of Anthony Albanese, who promises a more quiet type of diplomacy. Whether there will be a change in substance, that is something else, because when you look at, let's say, policies towards China, Southeast Asia, there wasn't that much difference in policies, but because of the change in tone, there may be a possibility of some kind of reset of certain relations.
Under Mr Morrison's leadership, relations with China did reach new lows, though, when the government led international calls for the investigation around the origins of the pandemic. Also, China responded by slapping sanctions on Australian goods like barley and wine. What might China be hoping for with Albanese?
Certainly, they will hope for less blunt and confrontational criticism, but we must remember that Albanese was quite critical of the previous government for not being tough enough on China, not being tough enough on the Solomon Islands. So, for example, the security arrangement made between Beijing and Solomon Islands was very heavily criticized by Albanese when he was in opposition, saying that Australia should have been more involved because this could present a security threat. And also here you have, in terms of the platform of the Labour Party under Albanese, that they want to establish a kind of defense school for the Pacific, which would bring in the countries around the periphery of China. So you have this kind of contradictory set of signals of a very significant policy toughness, but a shift in rhetoric, whether it's towards China or where Albanese said that he would like to reach out to France, where there had been this big dispute when Australia decided that they were going to change from buying a very substantial number of submarines from France to purchasing instead submarines that are nuclear powered, made by United States and Britain.
Just getting back to China, if you don't mind, there's a huge amount of pressure on Australian leaders to be quite strong on China, especially in terms of their ambitions. But also China is a huge investor in Australia in terms of agriculture, property. There's a lot of money to be had from good relations with China. Albanese has been accused of being a puppet to Beijing. How does Australia, or the current government in Australia, build a relationship with China that is not just going to be one that can show force against something that they describe as a threat, but also something that can be mutually inclusive of potential good development for the country?
It will be difficult, to square the circle, because there are concerns about security. So Chinese investments, and let's say in communications, for example, you have a variety of countries that have taken steps against Huawei, Canada included. And so under the new leadership, Australia is not likely to change on that. And so all investments will be scrutinized. And there's one additional problem, and that is that in the case of the Albanese government, they are very heavily invested in the protection of the environment in the kind of green revolution, which means that they will emphasize renewables. Now, Australia exports a good deal of raw materials to China. So the question is, how would that be affected by a greater move towards a green economy? And that may not even be a policy specifically directed at China, but there could be collateral damage, so to speak, from that if this new government means what it has been saying, and that they will move much more towards renewable and investments away from fossil fuels and from coal exploration and so on. And that could have an impact on investments from China, on technology companies that are involved in the Australian economy. And so we will have to wait and see. And also, there's a question of how stable this government is going to be. We are, as you had pointed out at the beginning in this program, there are votes still to be counted, so we do not know if this will be a workable majority with the help of certain independent parties, or will the Labour government be fairly solid itself? If it is vulnerable, then there may be a case where very small groups may have inordinate influence on domestic policies, which then would have repercussions and reverberations in terms of foreign policy relations, including those with China.
Part of the independent seats that were gained were pushing for a strong campaign on climate policy. Climate change is a huge issue for Australians. It's a country that's incredibly vulnerable to the changing climate. Under the Morrison government, Australia's reputation for combating climate change was fairly abysmal, I'd have to say. What do you think Albanese needs to do to become a world leader in climate action?
They certainly will have to reduce the carbon footprint of Australia, and that has certain repercussions. They will have to become less dependent on generating energy from fossil fuels. That in turn has certain implications in terms of exploration of certain minerals, like rare earth minerals, which can be highly toxic. Will there be environmental constraints placed on that? And those materials are quite important in terms of high technology. And I think this government is very heavily committed to the environment. They would lose a great deal of credibility if they do not deliver at least some substantive policies. And those policies, which may indeed have a beneficial effect on the environment, will nonetheless have geopolitical implications. I mean, look at the situation in the case of Russia. Russia has benefited from the Green Revolution because they have not really done much within Russia, but energy prices have risen, and Russia was then emboldened by having their coffers filled with revenue that they received from greater prices on energy. And that could be an effect as well. So there are at times unintended consequences, that there could be policies that are beneficial in one area, but they have consequences in another area that create complications.
Right. Aurel Braun, thank you very much for your time. Really appreciate it. Professor of International Relations and Political Science at the University of Toronto.